introduce Michael Fried, the J.R. Herbert Boone Emeritus Professor of the Humanities and the History of Art at Johns Hopkins. Fried is truly one of the greatest, one of the great humanists of our time. His scholarship is incredibly wide-ranging. He's the author of several landmark studies of French painting, including Absorption and Theatricality and Manet's Modernism, as well as books on Adolf Menzel, Caspar David Friedrich, Caravaggio, and contemporary painting and photography. His art criticism of the 60s and 70s, articulating an oppositional modernist perspective in the era of art's commodification, is collected in Art and Objecthood. He's also one of our most original literary critics, author of studies on Stephen Crane, Flaubert, and recently, What Was Literary Impressionism? A transformative account of the genre and of literature's relation to the physical act of writing. To top it off, he's published 4 volumes of poetry. I'm truly grateful to have him with us. His talk is entitled All or Nothing, Manet in the Early 1860s. Joanna Fiduccia, respondent, is an assistant professor in the history of art at Yale, where she teaches European modernism and the historical avant-garde. Her research focuses on the relationship between figuration, scale, and theories of representation in art and politics. Her other interests and parallel projects include the reconfiguration of gender in modernism, decorativeness, and the development of modern interiority, and the history and practice of attention. She's founding co-editor of the Journal of Art History Apricota, a member of the collective Estar Ser, hope I got that right, and a contributor of essays and articles on contemporary art for publications including Art Forum, October, Spike, and Parquet. She's currently completing her first book with Yale University Press, titled Figures of Crisis, Alberto Giacometti and the Myths of Nationalism. So thanks very much to our speaker and respondent. And Michael, just unmute yourself.
Great. It's a high level of technological skill sitting here. I can't imagine any conference I would find it more gratifying to take part in than this one. The title, Judgment and Value in the Humanities, What's Worth Conserving, resonates with my deepest feelings about what I do and why I do it. So when I was asked to speak, there was no question but that I would accept. The only question concerned the subject of my lecture. As Ben indicated in his introduction, I've covered a lot of ground one way or another. So there was a question of what to do, but in the end it became clear that the single figure who is most at the heart of a great deal of what I've thought and written about and looked at intensively, a figure for whom terms like judgment and value might have been devised in an attempt to capture his importance, is the 19th century French painter Edouard Manet. Some basic facts. Edouard Manet was born in 1832 to an haute bourgeois family in Paris. His father was a jurist, his mother the daughter of a diplomat. To help situate him chronologically, the major French realist painter of the previous generation, Gustave Courbet, was born in 1819, Charles Baudelaire and Gustave Flaubert in 1821, and Paul Cézanne and Claude Monet, the leading figures in the generation of painters after Manet, the group known as the Impressionists, in 1839 and 1840. Not surprisingly, Manet was expected to go into the law, but from an early age, his vocation toward painting was unstoppable. And eventually, around 1850, he entered the studio of an older painter, Thomas Couture. He remained there for 6 years, then went out on his own, and by 1859 and 1860 was making paintings of considerable interest. We have the first slide, please. Here, for example, is his Absinthe Drinker of 1859 in Copenhagen, a Baudelairean subject. And in fact, Manet and Baudelaire were flaneurs together in Paris during those years. We would love to know more about this, as you can imagine. But it was slightly later, in 1862 and 63 that Manet made his first truly inspired works, or as I would like to say in a modernist spirit, broke through to his core achievement in a series of electrifying canvases, including The Street Singer in Boston, The Old Musician in Washington, and the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass, and Olympia, both at the Musée d'Orsay. But for the bulk of this talk, I want to place before us another remarkable painting of those years. Next slide, please. Mademoiselle V, and it's V with 3 asterisks after it. Mademoiselle V in the costume of an espada, 1862, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. One reason for my focusing on Mademoiselle V, as I will call it, is personal. I grew up in the Bronx, and on many weekends from an early age was taken by my father or mother to one or the other of the 2 museums I loved, the Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I should also say that starting at an early age, I drew and painted more or less continually, and would often copy paintings or another passion, knights in armor at the Met, or various animal tableaus at the Museum of Natural History. My favorite painting at the Met, the one I could never see too often, was El Greco's incandescent view of Toledo, a work that still retains its special magic for me. But another canvas that fascinated me, that I sought out on visit after visit and could never come to the end of, so to speak, was Manet's Mademoiselle V. Let me try to suggest why. To start with the obvious, Mademoiselle V comes across as more or less life-size. In fact, it is nearly 5.5 feet high by something over 4 feet wide. The subject is a young woman, Manet's favorite model, Victorine Meurent, in the costume of a Spanish matador. The word espada refers to the rapier-like sword she wields in her right hand. Victorine also modeled for the outward-facing naked women in the Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Olympia, and for the rather elegantly clothed, one might even say demure, protagonist of the 1874 Gare Saint-Lazare. Eventually, she became an artist in her own right. In the early 1860s in Paris, Hispaniolism was the rage, owing in part to the popularity of the Spanish dance troupe, members of which Manet also painted. But dressing Victorine in a masculine costume was a risque thing to do. Look how it reveals her slim, almost androgynous figure. Not just sexually, but also because it immediately raised the question of Manet's seriousness. How did he intend his painting to be taken? Was it a kind of joke, la blague, as the French said, portraying Mademoiselle V, whoever she was? What was the point of the initial and asterisks, as a figure in a masquerade? And what about the loosely painted bullfight of sorts taking place behind her? Surely that was not to be taken at face value, whatever doing so might mean. These and similar questions were given added point by another painting of a slightly later moment, the game-changing Déjeuner sur l'herbe, especially when the 2 canvases appeared together in the notorious Salon des Refusés of 1863. Very briefly, so many paintings were rejected by the jury for the official salon of that year that Napoleon III authorized an extraordinary salon of the rejected artists, in which the latter could show their work should they choose to do so. Manet was one of those who exhibited, and it was there, above all on the basis of the Déjeuner, that he first became a target of public scandal and ridicule. Of course, he also leaped at once to the forefront of the art-going public's attention, for better or worse. In any case, the subject of Mademoiselle V, a young woman in the costume of a Spanish bullfighter, wearing a black hat with a flat rim while holding a sword aloft in her right hand and bearing a pinkish cape in her left, seems designed to draw the viewer's attention. That's a reasonable strategy. The competition for notice in the crowded confines of the salon was always fierce. Next image, please. Then there is her facial expression, which typically for Manet during these years, and indeed later, is pretty much unreadable. That is, she appears alert, one might even say hyper alert, with the barest hint of a smile perhaps on her lips or perhaps not. It's impossible to be sure. But what is perfectly clear is that her wide-eyed gaze directly confronts the beholder, for whom, in a certain sense, but what sense exactly, she appears to be posing. Note too that her face is brightly illuminated as if from the front, with only a touch of shadow, a feature that adds to the impression of psychic opacity or blankness. It's also a feature shared by many of the key personages in Manet's paintings of the first half of the 1860s. And in fact, commentators on Manet have long recognized the strong tendency in his pictures to suppress traditional modeling or shading in favor of stark, quasi-photographic contrasts of light and dark. Almost invariably, though, this has been associated with the idea of flatness, leading to the further claim, going back to Zola, but receiving its canonical statement in the writings of the late Clement Greenberg, that Manet's paintings insist on their flatness. It's often added as no painting before them had done, and by virtue of that fact, marked the inception of modernism in painting at slightly greater length. For Greenberg, modernism in the arts required that each art, by a process of continual self-criticism, discover and isolate its literal essence, and that in the case of painting, that essence turned out to be flatness and the delimitation of flatness. From which it followed for Greenberg that by virtue of his painting's flatness, Manet should be seen as the first modernist painter. As you're doubtless aware, most art historians today would profess to deplore Greenberg's formalism. But it's also important to recognize that all but a small handful would not disagree with the proposition that Manet's paintings thematize flatness and would not hesitate to cite Mademoiselle V as a case in point. May I have the next image, please? Not that it makes no sense to see Mademoiselle V in those terms. For one thing, as I've said, there's the suppression of traditional shading. And for another, there's the marked absence of a convincing illusion of three-dimensional space, driven home by the oddly scaled bullfight scene behind Victorine, which I've described as loosely painted, words that hardly do justice to our sense of the conspicuous and surely deliberate contrast between the execution of the scene and the much tighter and more precise treatment of the figure of Victorine. Not only that, there's also the disorienting steepness of the recession of the ground beneath Victorine's feet, or if not quite beneath her feet, at any rate starting somewhat beyond her and extending back to the wooden wall at the base of the imaginary arena in which she stands. The abrupt shift in the ground as it recedes from relative darkness, a kind of mossy brown, to a sunlit zone. Note the shadows cast by the horse, rider, and bull, adds to the sense of disorientation. In any case, there's no question of the viewer being made to feel that the painting offers an illusionistic space continuous with the viewer's own. Finally, too, there's the pinkish cape that Victorine holds in her left hand, which not only is loosely brushed, but appears much too small and weightless to be useful in any confrontation with a bull. And indeed, on close looking, gives the impression of having been inserted, painted into a blank patch in the ground that had been left for it, further divesting it of all sense of reality. Even as a kid, I found that cape a source of visual puzzlement. The question, though, is whether it's faithful to one's experience of the Mademoiselle V to characterize the various features I've just cited under the single rubric of flatness. By now, you will have gathered that I'm convinced that it is not. Indeed, that to reduce Manet's innovations and inconsistencies and seemingly intentional solecisms to the notion of flatness is to settle for a gross simplification. Rather, from an early but no doubt post-childhood stage in my interactions with Manet's oeuvre generally, I felt that any account of his enterprise that I would find compelling had to attach primary significance to another feature of his art, one that characterizes almost all his important paintings, from the Old Musician of 1862 to the Barreau Folie Bergère of 20 years later, namely that the key figure in the representation gazes directly out at the viewer. This is true of Mademoiselle V, of course, and what I'm urging is that we take the fact of Victorine's looking at one. Notice that she turns her head to do so, but at the same time palpably holding one at a certain distance, in the sense of offering no imaginative access to her state of mind as a central datum about the work. Or to put this slightly differently, that we understand Mademoiselle V in the costume of an espada to be facing us with a certain emphasis, as if what has been construed as an assertion of flatness is better described as the painting as a whole, including the features I've just cited, turning toward the beholder, who in turn finds himself or herself or themselves compelled to acknowledge their own implication in some sort of preconceived and in an important sense impersonal relationship to it. Preconceived and impersonal, meaning that the place of the beholder, as in Mademoiselle V, has been forcefully staked out by the painting with no specific beholder, certainly not me or you or us or them in view. In my book, Manet's Modernism, or the Face of Painting in the 1860s, I suggested precisely that state of affair, that Manet's paintings strongly and persistently address a beholder who is not, who cannot be the person standing before the canvas, who therefore, as I also say, is made to feel supererogatory to the basic situation, was a major source of the resistance his work generated, and indeed of the awkwardness I suspect more than a few contemporary viewers continue to feel in its presence. Having mentioned Manet's modernism, I'm led to say a bit more about my grown-up dealings with the artist. In the first place, as already mentioned, I was familiar from early on with the outstanding assortment of pictures by Manet at the Met. Then as an undergraduate at Princeton, I became friends with Frank Stella, a year ahead of me, who was already en route to becoming one of the essential painters of our generation. Stella and I revered Manet and often talked about him. For Greenberg, whom I met when I was still an undergraduate, Manet was the first modernist painter, though, as I've said, on grounds I came later to challenge. As a graduate student at Harvard, I wrote a dissertation on Manet's use of what I called sources in earlier art in his paintings of the first half of the 1860s. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Finally, while teaching at Johns Hopkins, I came to write Manet's Modernism as the third panel in a triptych that begins with absorption and theatricality, painting and beholder in the age of Diderot, and continues with Courbet's realism. I mention the trilogy because, as the subtitle of Absorption and Theatricality states, it centrally concerns the ongoing problematic of the relation between painting and beholder, a problematic that, as I show in detail, first arose in France around the middle of the 18th century, where and when it received its first and by far its most sophisticated theoretical formulation in the pioneer art criticism, also writings on the stage, of the infinitely engaging polymath philosophe Denis Diderot. I counted among the essential virtual encounters of my life that Diderot was waiting for me when I was ready for him. As for the themes of judgment and value, it was Diderot who wrote that the determining audience for art was what he called la petite église invisible. Today, perhaps more invisible than ever, but also perhaps more vitally important to the perpetuation of artistic and intellectual seriousness. The present talk isn't really the place, there isn't the time for even a brief exposition of the basic terms of the painting beholder problematic I'm referring to. Though I will say that around the middle of the 18th century in France, the presence of the beholder emerged as a source of potential distraction for the figures in the painting, who therefore had to be made resistant to that possibility by virtue of their seeming absorption in whatever they were doing, thinking, and feeling. Also crucial to this project was the emergence of a new, more encompassing form of compositional unity, involving not just matters of design, but more importantly, the actional, or say dramatic relations among the depicted personages. Such a form of unity effectively closed the painting vis-a-vis the beholder. Thus, in one of Diderot's treatises on the stage, he urged both playwright and actor to act as if the curtain never rose. In 18th and early 19th century painting, the decisive figures are successively Chardin, Greuze, David, Géricault, and Daumier. In Courbet's realism and Manet's modernism, I track the subsequent evolution of this fundamentally anti-theatrical conception of the art of painting, with the aim of showing how by around 1860, the devices or technologies that Diderot had advocated no longer worked as they had earlier done. which is to say that they had largely lost their capacity to establish the ontological illusion that there was no one standing before the painting. Put more strongly, that the beholder did not exist. Needless to say, I'm summarizing an argument made over hundreds of pages. Understood in this light, Manet represents the moment when the art of painting responds to this unprecedented crisis by decisively giving up the Diderottian protocols and choosing instead to take the radical step of turning toward and facing the beholder with the disorienting consequences I've tried to evoke. One might think that by doing so, the art of painting embraced the theatricality it had previously sought to hold at bay. But as I've tried to suggest, it was a kind of abstract, totalizing, presentational theatricality that in my account significantly changed the basic terms of the problematic, and by so doing turned out to secure the future of ambitious painting on a new basis, a future realized most immediately by the somewhat younger Impressionists. Part of my effort in Manet's modernism was to show, by intensive reading in the art critics of the time, first, that Manet's move away from absorption and closure was a major source of many art critics' unhappiness with his art. And second, a related point, that his paintings were repeatedly described in terms of what I came to call facingness. Indeed, another term of criticism deployed by me to account for the writer's discomfort with his art is the notion of strikingness, by which I meant to characterize the persistent note of aggression toward the viewer that the critics found in his canvases. So one writer spoke of coming upon Olympia as equivalent to having a glass of water dashed in one's face, the metaphor implying not just aggression, but a kind of instantaneousness. And in fact, if we look again at the Mademoiselle V, we will be struck, it's the exact word, by the sheer force and sharpness of Victorine's scimitar-like silhouette, as well as by the masterly, but nevertheless subtly jarring contrast between her black costume and pearly white stockings and the ground beyond her. The black outfit profiled against the sunlit portion of the ground, the white stockings gleaming against the shadowy portion down below, not to mention the unexpected coloristic accents of her scarves and cape. Manet is one of the supreme painters of black, almost the equal of Franz Hals in that regard. More broadly, it would be hard to overestimate what can rightly be called the striking power of Manet's canvases of these breakthrough years. This was brought home to me when several years ago, may we have the next image, please? At the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Manet's Old Musician of 1862, another painting I admire almost beyond measure, it's the one at the left, as you can see, was for several weeks come next to Picasso's famous Family of Saltimbanques of 1905, a picture inspired in part by Manet's canvas. Put simply, the old musician blew the Family of Saltimbanques away. Or if that seems too melodramatic, let me simply remark that it was the Manet that one's gaze kept returning to, from which indeed it was hard to tear one's gaze away. I hope it's clear that I mean this not as a criticism of Picasso, but as a token of my admiration of Manet. In any case, within a few years, Picasso was to paint his Demoiselle d'Avignon, another Manet-inspired work, and one whose striking power can hardly be questioned. So, facingness and strikingness. Also a deliberate refusal of effects of interiority, psychology, mindedness, not always but often, as if to discourage the wrong sort of interest on the part of the beholder. Not surprisingly, this was another source of acute dissatisfaction on the part of Manet's critics, and in truth, it remains a disconcerting feature of his art down to the present day. What does Mademoiselle V, the painting, the personage, want from us, we may sometimes wonder. And one more set of considerations, which I'll treat only briefly. In Manet's paintings of the first half of the 1860s, and after, only less consistently, one becomes aware, and we have the next slide, please, of a strategy of deliberate allusion to earlier painters and paintings. For example, The Old Musician, 1862, in the National Gallery, a work that could bear much deeper analysis than I can give it here, includes deliberate references to, allusions to, virtual quotations of Velázquez, The brothers Lenain, the marvelous 18th century painter Watteau, perhaps others besides, Murillo, for example. In my PhD dissertation, almost immediately published under the title Manet's Sources in an entire issue of the contemporary art magazine Art Forum, not a brilliant career move, as I was made to realize, and at greater length and with, I hope, a more refined argument in Manet's modernism, I put forward a reading of Manet's relations with earlier art that saw him as identifying with a particular conception of the French tradition, essentially realist, popular, republican, as against idealist, aristocratic, royalist, and then going beyond Frenchness with a certain idea of universality in painting, or what I also called painting altogether. I thereby understood Manet's art as responding not only to a crisis of anti-theatricality, but also simultaneously to one of historical continuity with, or at least connection to, the canonical achievements of the past, which were then becoming newly visible on the walls of museums and owing to the rise of a newly conceived proto-art history. Just how live these issues were for Manet is suggested by Baudelaire's 1865 letter from self-imposed exile in Brussels, in which he rather brutally declares, quote, "You are only the first in the decrepitude of your art." And from another angle, here is one of the foremost art critics and proto-art historians of the period, an older figure known to Manet, the socialist Théophile Thoré, writing in 1860. This is Thoré. In order to arrive at being able to write a history of European art since the Renaissance, a project that seems to torment our epoch, how interesting that is, it is necessary to distribute justice among the various schools of painting, national schools, to establish their distinctive and essential qualities, to reconsider each country's claims and give each its due role in the general development of art. Instinctively, one feels today that each nation is preparing itself for a kind of last judgment, after which, the past having been liquidated, we will enter a new world. An extraordinary statement, to me still to this day, a stunning statement. I hope you will agree. Thoré, not at all incidentally, was a major intellectual source for Manet's thinking about national schools, the French school in particular. I'm not proposing, of course, that Manet's engagement with earlier art amounts in any way to the liquidation of that art. But I do want to suggest that for Manet as for Thoré, the relation of the present moment to previous achievement was an unresolved issue with which his paintings, like Thoré's writings, may be understood to engage. One might say that one import of Manet's citations was to liquidate the problem of overall connectivity between contemporary endeavor and the art of the museums. At any rate, no painter of a later generation would find it necessary to come to grips with the entire expanse of painting since the Renaissance, as I'm suggesting Manet did. And something else, universality for Manet, as for Thoré, was a notion with political connotations. Perhaps one might say that Manet sought to bring together the idea of universality with the artistic seriousness implied by Diderot's Petite Église Invisible. Can one imagine anything of the sort in our time? I mean that as a real question. And perhaps there's a real answer in the work of certain contemporary artists for whom the pursuit of value goes hand in hand with the ambition for universality. May I have the next image, please? In the case of Mademoiselle V, to return to our prime object, there is in the first place the explicit reference to Goya's tauromachia etchings in the bullfight scene behind Victorine. Then there is a trio of proposals from me, Theodore Reff, and Beatrice Farwell for candidate sources or references in works by Rubens, Titian, and Raphael, respectively, all of which, in my view, have a certain plausibility, along with, perhaps more profoundly than any of these, a harking back to Watteau's scenes of commedia dell'arte performers, my larger claim being that Watteau during these years was a major presence in Manet's pictorial imaginaire. Much more might be said about Manet's relations with earlier art, but I've dealt with that at length in Manet's modernism, so anyone interested in the topic can pursue it there. At this juncture, though, I want to raise one last set of considerations about Mademoiselle V, and more broadly about Manet's art during the 1860s. Namely, the sense in which the most compelling of his pictures of these decisive years engage the issue of artistic quality, of their success as painting, more emphatically, by which I mean more nakedly and inescapably than any body of painting had ever done. This may seem an unlikely claim. Didn't other innovative artists face the risk of being misunderstood, as Baudelaire, citing Wagner and Chateaubriand, as much as says in his notorious letter to Manet, and we could equally cite Géricault, Delacroix, and Courbet among recent figures? The answer, I think, is yes and no. Yes, to a certain degree, as artists such as those and others sought to impose their visions in the visual cacophony of the official salons, the basic arena for establishing one's reputation in late 18th and 19th century France. And no, more importantly, in that no painter before Manet, and I would even say since Manet, not only during those decades, but in the course of the centuries going back to the Renaissance, ever had to face even a portion of the ridicule, incomprehension, and outright hostility that greeted, for example, the Déjeuner sur l'herbe when it was shown in the Salon des Refusés in 1863, or Olympia in the Salon of 1865. We'll glance at the Déjeuner in a moment, but before leaving Mademoiselle V, I want to draw attention one more time to the boldness and, so to speak, the willfulness of the contrast in execution between the figure of Victorine and the bullfight scene to the right, a contrast heightened by Manet's decision to have the tail of the picador's horse make surface contact with the back of Victorine's high-waisted jacket, thereby compelling the viewer to strain to make visual sense of the juxtaposition in a single take. In a similar spirit, Manet appears to have made only the flimsiest gesture toward rendering the folds and texture of the fabric of the cape, which the viewer is forced to read as floating almost immaterially to Victorine's left. These were features of a picture that puzzled me endlessly when I was a kid, and I was right to be puzzled, because it still isn't clear, anyway not to me, how Manet meant them to be taken. Certainly they can't be taken realistically, and yet, as I stress in Manet's modernism, he unquestionably understood himself to be a realist in his basic orientation. So what exactly did he anticipate as regards the viewer's likely response to the work? Here's one way I've come to think about this. Mademoiselle V places before the viewer an extreme pair of alternatives. Either to find oneself convinced by it, exactly as it is, which is to say, as an aesthetic whole, as what the French 19th century called a tableau, in all its challenging particulars, or to withhold one's conviction, to be put off by its effective opacity and internal inconsistencies. In short, to resist the picture's, to my mind, undeniable allure in the name of a more familiar and comprehensible pictorial ideal. Put slightly differently, Mademoiselle V raises the stakes of the pictorial encounter to a degree that marks a new turning in the evolution of the art of painting, as if the viewer's response to it, as never quite before, is a matter of all or nothing, conviction or skepticism, with no way station between. In 1863, in the conditions of the Salon des Refusés, such conviction was hard to come by, to say the least. May I have the next slide, please? But it's above all in the Déjeuner sur l'herbe that the double question of artistic intelligibility and pictorial quality gets raised with the sheerest force, exponentially, I'm inclined to say. The Déjeuner is no doubt familiar to everyone in this audience, but just to rehearse the obvious. 4 personages, 2 men and 2 young women, are enjoying a picnic in the environs of Paris. The men are stylishly dressed. One wears a cap and holds a thin cane. The nearer of the 2 women, again modeled for by Victorine Meurent, naked except for minuscule earrings and a black band in her hair, sits on the ground, actually on what appears to be a piece of clothing that she has removed, gazing directly out of the painting. while the other woman, wearing a shift and farther away. But how far away? As in Mademoiselle V, something seems spatially off, bends over so as to scoop water from what appears to be a stream. To what purpose, one hesitates to think. The original title of the painting was Le Bain. A still life of the straw basket, fruit, and a bakery roll is spread out at the lower left, along with a woman's straw hat and perhaps some feminine clothing. In the lower left corner of the canvas, you probably can't, I'm sure you can't see this, a briskly painted frog squats as if in annoyance. To the right of the bathing woman, we notice a rowboat, presumably used by the picnickers, and in the upper middle of the canvas, a bullfinch with wings extended has been captured frozen in flight. The déjeuner is unusually large for Manet, nearly 9 feet wide by nearly 7 feet high. As in the case of Mademoiselle V, only much more glaringly, it is anything but clear beyond the subject of picnicking what is going on. The facial expression of the bearded man next to Victorine could not be more bland and unrevealing. Where is he looking anyway? The other man, also bearded, viewed in profile, makes an undecipherable semi-pointing gesture with his right hand. And Victorine, supporting her chin in her right hand, pays them no attention as she gazes directly out of the picture with a quietly engaging, though in the end unreadable, expression on her face. The addressing force of her gaze is remarkable, though. As already suggested, the bathing woman seems oddly sized for the presumptive distance from the others, just one respect in which, despite the brilliance of the paintwork across much of the canvas, an air of unreality, of deliberate artifice pervades the image as a whole. In fact, as was recognized early on, the relations among the three principal figures are closely based on a figure group of water gods and nymphs in an engraving after Raphael by Marcantonio Raimondi. As has also been noted, the combination of a naked woman and clothed men had a well-known precedent in Titian's Concert Champêtre in Manet's time, attributed to Giorgione. In addition, the subject is a fête champêtre, the specialty of Watteau, in whom, as I've already said, Manet was intensely interested during these years. Plus, the rowboat in a picture of a morally questionable picnic was perhaps intended to recall a notorious work by Gustave Courbet, The Demoiselle on the Banks of the Seine of 1856. None of this, however, would have served to make the déjeuner intelligible to its original audience. And if we are truthful with ourselves, we will have to admit that on the plane of narrative, psychology, and illusionistic consistency, it remains adamantly impenetrable to the present day. Of course, there's much more that may be said about the déjeuner. Again, I would refer you to Manet's modernism, where, among other observations, I note that it pointedly includes references to multiple genres of painting. Another aspect of Manet's project, I understand, is motivated by a pursuit of painting altogether. That's why there's such a large expanse of green around the figures, so as to send the message landscape. The three main figures are portraits. The basket, fruit, and roll to the left compose a still life. Victorine spectacularly is a nude, and the subject, as I've noted more than once, is a fête champêtre. Even the bullfinch is a parodic reference to the dove of the Holy Ghost in scenes of Christ's baptism, hence to religious painting generally. And does the frog make it also an animal painting? I hesitate to say. Once again, art writing of the time is relevant. In this case, an article by Manet's friend, Zachary Estruc, calling for the transcending of individual genres in and by what he called the résumé. But given the framework of this talk, and in view of the fact that I'm almost out of time, I'll simply raise the ante and claim that the déjeuner, in the terms I've just adumbrated, is without a doubt the most all or nothing painting in the entire history of art. Either you stand transfixed before it or you don't. And if you don't, I don't know what I can say or do that can alter your state of mind. I'm exaggerating. As a teacher, I found lots to say, largely along the lines I've been sketching here. I hope it helped. Something else I've remarked to generations of students is that for me, there is the centuries-long history of painting leading up to the déjeuner. Then the astonishing, transformative, in some respects, cataclysmic event of the déjeuner itself, followed by the dialectic of painting, of modernist painting ever since, almost 160 years. This is to suggest that in the face of the déjeuner, concepts like judgment and value themselves take on new meaning. I've come to the end of my talk, but before closing shop, I want to ask your indulgence for another minute or two. Ben mentioned near the introducing me that I've published 4 books of poems. In one of these, The Next Bend in the Road, there appears a poem in unrhymed 2-line stanzas called Le Déjeuner Célèbre, which I propose to read to you. It's dedicated to T.J. Clark, an art historian friend who's written memorably about Manet. One piece of information that bears on the last 2 lines: before Manet's paintings came to be hung in the Musée d'Orsay, they, along with the works of the Impressionists and others, were exhibited in the Jeu de Paume, a much smaller building at one end of the Tuileries. Because of the restricted space, the paintings were somewhat jammed together. But I remember natural lighting, and in any case, they looked tremendous, none more so than the déjeuner. Here then is the poem. Le Déjeuner Célèbre. A bullfinch poses in mid-flight, like the Holy Ghost above the picnickers. In a pond in the middle distance, a woman wearing a shift seems, I repeat, seems to be douching herself. The other woman, naked, seated on the grass and twisting her rubbery neck to look at us, is no beauty, but try to ignore her. In contrast, the men are expendable. There is nothing going on in their heads. Their gestures are vacuous. Their wide open eyes gleam meaninglessly. Only their bright accoutrements reward our attention, especially the clay gray trousers, miniature cane, rose cravat, and black pillbox cap of the type on the left. In the lower left corner, an angry calligraphic frog wonders why these stilted Parisian nobodies have invaded his bright green woodland world. It was a moment in the history of the art of painting when the weight of the broken water rushing out to sea exactly counterbalanced the force of the waves racing in. No matter how hard we try, we cannot imagine actually entering that space, partaking of that food, breathing that non-existent air. When, at the age of 18, I first stood staring and breathless in the Jeu de Paume, what most astounded me was that the paint appeared still wet. Thank you.
All right. First, I wanted to give my sincere thanks to the organizers for the invitation and to Michael Fried himself. It's really such a pleasure to respond to these arguments, which have accompanied me across my study and my teaching of modernism. All right. I'd like to begin by taking up what I see as the key question of this talk in the context of this symposium. Namely, what is the role of judgment in artwork that compel an all or nothing response? Alternatives that seem to entail a suspension of judgment. To think through that question, I'll return just for a few minutes more to Manet's Mademoiselle Vie and to its teasing address of a claim underlying the notion that judgment and value are humanist concerns. That claim is, namely, that certain objects are best suited to cultivating our capacities for good judgment and right value, objects that quite simply merit our attention. Finally, I'll end with some thoughts on the petite église invisible invoked by Diderot, that small invisible church whose identity and function must answer to the same questions circulating these 2 days, questions of power, aesthetic as well as political, and questions of collective purpose. So, all or nothing. It may appear that the viewer's all or nothing comprises judgment, albeit of a once and for all, if not instantaneous sort. In this sense, the position of all or conviction would seem not merely to suggest being convinced, but convicting, as if juridically, the painting. One is for it or against it. Yet Fried's language here is more subtle. In front of these Manet paintings, he says, we are either convinced or skeptical. We give or withhold our conviction. If we give it, we cease to weigh the painting's particulars, to wish away its less successful passages, to dismiss it as unresolved. We also leave off crediting our doubts and resistances, our negations of the work, postures that, surely not coincidentally, find themselves signaled in Manet's vis-a-vis, in the toreadors who turn their back on the foreground scene, in the figure who flees it altogether, heaving himself over the arena wall, or in Victorine's own detached, self-absenting gaze. Our conviction in the painting as an aesthetic whole appears to compensate for the conviction that Victorine withholds from her performance of gender or selfhood. It is what Fried calls Manet's deliberate refusal of the effects of interiority that allows us to escape the narrowness of our own personality and thus to join with that community of meaning on which art formally and morally depends. What tends to stand in the way of this conviction, Fried shows us, is the painting's inconsistency, one that appears to call Manet's seriousness into question. Is the painting a kind of joke? Here I may depart from Fried because I think it is a kind of one. But the joke is not Victorine's transvestism, nor Manet's convulsive shifts in scale or style, or anything that might suggest that he is trying to pull one over on the viewer. The joke, it seems to me, is not on us, but about us, about whatever it is that we are doing when we look at a painting. To wit, just as Victorine is enacting the bullfighter, so we may be enacting the bull. We can understand this in two ways. One, we are bull-like when we are fixated, confounded by a particular detail in a painting, fascinated or outraged by it. Or two, to be bull-like is to be taken in by a painting, specifically by its illusionism. The bull mistakes the cape for a body, we mistake the painting for space. This is where Manet's wit really scintillates, for the cape gripped by Victorine's hand is truly no cloak, but blatantly paint, a blob of off-color icing, as Carol Armstrong has put it. Thus, the wrong viewer, the one too passionately interested in the detail to see the aesthetic whole, paradoxically gets the right answer, which is also certainly the wrong answer, namely that we are taken in, we fixate on, nothing more than paint, blatantly. Painting comes to grips with itself in Victorine's hand, and in analogy it suspends between holding and beholding. But again, this, it seems to me, is a joke about the viewer as bull, whose disclosure of the facticity of paint, the perfect inverse of Paris's painted curtain, which fooled Zeuxis, is just another form of credulity. Still, if Mademoiselle V just about the zones of intensity in a painting or our wrong engagement of them, it yet does not subsume these passages in the totalizing all of our response. A selective, even blinding attention remains in this work, solicited as well as thematized by it. I don't see how we can unsee it. Let me return now to conviction suspension of judgment. One of Fried's beautiful, powerful claims is that the value of Manet's paintings in these years is their capacity to surmount a crisis of historical continuity in European art. Manet's painting offers not a liquidation of Europe's competing patrimonies, but the glimmer or mirage of a universal art on the other side of their audit. And here I'm recalling Fried's quotation of Théophile Thoré, who alludes to the last judgment that's coming to all the schools of painting. Manet seems to call to us from beyond the time of crisis, a phrase I've come to think of as the great aporia of art history itself, with its dual commitments to historicism and to objects that axiomatically escape it. The historian Reinhard Koselleck has tracked the evolution of the word crisis from a medical term to describe the decisive moment in the progress of an illness to a theological concept where that same fatefulness determined our everlasting life. Crisis emerges into its modern sense, still bearing the residues of these older meanings. And it's the resulting ambiguity of the term that gives it its grist as a structural signature of modernity. According to Koselleck, we juggle three semantic models of crisis. The first assimilates crisis to the work of historical consciousness itself. We might think here of Schiller's dictum, world history is the world's tribunal, where judgments come down to us in the form of historical denouement. The second imagines crisis as an epochal threshold, a critical period after which the world will be different. And then there's finally a scatological crisis, however transfigured into global warfare or climate change. Koselleck appends a final sense that you could track back to the young Hegelians who correlated crisis with critique, or the attempt to break through and to discard the shell of the past. One question might be where we are to understand Manet among these models. In his time, perhaps enacting the first one of them, but in our time, perhaps up to something else. For I think one of the points of the experience of Mademoiselle V and the Déjeuner, as narrated by Fried, is that the crisis of history never has to arrive for us to understand Manet's achievement. Those who can extract themselves from the struggle for recognition can see a future cosmopolitanism, or to use Fried's term, universality, lying just beyond Manet's painting. They are that audience, fit though few, as Milton put it, who can see in this hypothetical cosmopolitanism promises both aesthetic and political. But it seems important to note that when this cosmopolitanism is actual rather than hypothetical or propositional, it can be met with reactionary defensiveness from the very same people who consider themselves part of that very little invisible in church of conviction. And I'm speaking here of the work to decenter Europe from our art historical accounts and our syllabi, to rethink our scholarship through the discrepant cosmopolitanisms of modernism. There is a real tension here, or perhaps I mean a real risk of how we imagine that little invisible church. And parenthetically, I do wonder if Diderot is altogether serious about it, or whether there isn't something also slightly tongue-in-cheek about his praise of any church, however unreal. All the same, when I think on it, I can't reject the idea of it altogether. The intimate and invisible congregation around the work seems too vital to my own sense of value in the experience of art. So I want to close by speaking to a couple characteristics of this church as Diderot conceived it, characteristics that may helpfully displace the invisible church of the elect from the image it evokes of shadowy institutional power. The first is that the judgments of the little church are belated and untimely. As Diderot writes, though they will sooner or later assure the artist her proper place in history, these judgments are usually a little late in coming, too late to make much material or moral difference to her life. So the members of this church are relatively powerless to affect fortunes. Second, the church has no substance, no permanent home, only fleeting instantiations that could be anywhere, that could be everywhere. All of this tracks with me, the weakness and untimeliness, as well as the shimmering emergence of a group joined only by shared protocols and beliefs, which include abundantly skepticism about the work of art. This group gathers temporarily in the seminar room, in the break room, in the bar, really in any place where people share in the project of looking or reading at our practices of meaning making. I'm aware this may seem deflating, but see ample reason that one would prefer the expansiveness of the elective grouping over the merely asserted authority of the elect. It is finally in this light of that grouping that I grasp the distinction between what I notice and what I attend. What fascinates or outrages me may be altogether different from what I value in any particular artwork as such. The latter seems worth holding up for others to behold. It is what I judge worth showing to others in anticipation, not of their assent, but of our little colloquy. I'm not saying meaningfulness exists only within the bounds of that discussion, but simply that my meaningful, non-bull-like attention stands in relation to it. I think then that I understand the vertiginous effect of Manet's painting altogether to depend less on the idea that all of painting should be somehow reckoned there, a notion ever harder to sustain the broader and more transnational grows our sense of tradition. It may result instead from the feeling of futurity, paradoxically generated through a painting's recapitulation of the past. I recall here Deleuze and Guattari's description of the monument, which rather than celebrate some past event, confides to the ears of the future the enduring sensations that give it its body. The elective grouping is where those sensations vibrate, with an intensity owing perhaps as much to its shared conviction as its dissensus. All right, I will leave off there and open to questions from the group.
Thank you. That was terrific. I don't actually, let's bracket the whole question of the bull. Obviously that's not a route that I want to take, but I totally take the point of that is a certain kind of account of the picture. Beyond that, I'm not sure that we have any disagreement beyond my natural generational skepticism about the global developments within art history. But again, that's a larger topic. Yeah, actually, let's open it to questions from the floor. I don't quite know how to address what you said. I don't know whether we're in any kind of disagreement. The one thing that might be worth my saying is that, as you're well aware, my practice through my whole career, such as it's been in relation to painting and sculpture, has been dual. I mean, obviously art historical, but I've been very, very, very actively involved in art criticism. And art criticism is, I'd say, more than literary criticism, more nakedly than literary criticism. It's evaluative. It's involved in making judgments. And I've been doing that since I was 22 in Britain. And if you do that, I mean, you are trying to identify what you take to be the best art of your moment, and you are intervening. I mean, you're not simply registering a judgment. You're trying to push things a certain way. Once I saw Anthony Caro's sculptures, I had the conviction that this was the work of one of the two best sculptors in the world, the other being the American David Smith. And I wanted that understood. I wanted that seen. And I don't quite know to what extent this bears on what you've said, but it's to sort of try to activate the petit église invisible. I mean, that is to say, I want to emphasize how militant that can be, how much you are contending for a particular point of view, how much you're suggesting that certain things that are widely admired are, in fact, not good at all. The entire critical struggle to make certain views, to impose certain views, to oppose others, and indeed, then there are stretches where you realize you've lost. I mean, there I am arguing against theatricality in contemporary art back in 1966 and 67, and for 20 years, nothing but theatricality, wall-to-wall theatricality, except for a handful of artists. But then you stand by what you believe, and then things turn out to change in ways that, for example, I could never have anticipated. But I'm probably getting away from your point. It's simply to say that yes, in my own work, the activity of judgment has been part of what I do. To an extent, it's unusual in art history. Maybe that's this isn't, I'm not responding adequately to what you said. Let's open it up to the floor. Unless there's something you would like to say back to that.
Well, maybe while we're waiting for hands, I have a separate question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So in the final minutes of the paper, you bring us so vividly through the déjeuner before concluding with a poem that you could say maybe seeks to do some of the same thing in bringing our eye through it, or perhaps not. So I wonder how you think about ekphrasis in the poem in relation to art historical description.
I don't think of them as fundamentally different, except that poetry has its own laws. I mean, you when you're writing a poem, you're trying to write a good poem, and that's going to impose certain things. But as you could tell, I mean, a lot of the observations are the same, the actual observations. In the poem, I can actually say that possibly that woman is douching herself, which I probably wouldn't say in an art historical article. I'd say, you know, to what purpose one can only imagine. Yeah, so I don't think of them as fundamentally different, apart from saying that writing poetry is writing poetry, and that's always different. But thank you for the question. Put it another way, this is something I'm sure you'd agree with. Okay, I'll take it back in time. When I was in graduate school, which was I started graduate school at Harvard in 1962. I couldn't recognize anything that I might ever possibly do in any of the art historical journals. Fundamentally, that's true to this day. You know, you read the Art Bulletin, you'd read all those journals, and for example, one word that would never appear in it ever is I. Nothing could ever be first person. It was all an impersonal display of sometimes awesomely impressive scholarship. And I used to wonder, I mean, I both loved the subject. To this day, I love the subject of art history. I don't at all love the field of art history. I feel I've always felt that's a whole other topic. But it's been very hard for the field of art history to realize that writing about painting or writing about sculpture, writing about art is writing. Whatever else it is, it's writing. And the work of doing this kind of work is a work of writing. And I'm riffing off of what you raised about poetry. So that for me, the art writing, the art history art writing I care about most has a quality of writing that lots of art history has almost deliberately eschewed. In relation to this, I think a very key development was in the early 1970s. Journals started to print by photo offset lithography. And that meant that overnight, you could have a critical inquiry or representations of a journal or an October that could take illustrations that they couldn't take before because they had to engrave plates. So the economics of journal publishing changed. And that, for people like me and Tim Clark and Svetlana Alpers and a whole world of sort of ambitious young art historians and all, was like a miracle. You didn't have to go through the Art Bulletin. You didn't have to be vetted by the previous generation of, I won't even try to find the right word. I mean, you could escape the normal art history judgmental grid, and you could escape the prevailing rhetorical grid. And it made possible, I think, a new kind of art writing. which for me has been, fundamental. Again, I'm just taking advantage of your raising the question about poetry.
Absolutely, thank you. I see David has a question.
Thank you, Michael. You can hear me?
Yes, yeah, perfectly. Hiya, David.
Let me ask you about the déjeuner célèbre. The hatted figure could be seen as a reverse of the Moses, of the Adam on the Sistine ceiling. He is a river god, lifted knee, reclining pose. He has his hand extended. Are we back? Is this about the recreation of painting itself? Is that one way? I mean, given what you've been saying, is that Manet is essentially trying to recreate a tradition from, in some ways liquidating and at the same time insisting on something new. Are we looking at these two Parisians as coming in a new Eden? Is this part of what may be going on here?
I think it isn't, because of the exactness of the quotation from the Raphael group of figure gods and water. I mean, in other words, my saying that I think it isn't is not an issue of principle. It's, I think Manet is working so much off of the Raphael Marc Antonio Raimondi precedent. But I mean, what you raise, it is, for me, it is so hard to imagine Manet's frame of mind. I mean, he would show paintings like that thinking that he might get the Legion of Honor or a gold prize at the Salon. It feels crazy. I mean, he keeps, that goes throughout his whole career. There's actually a point in his career where the critics are almost willing to give in. And they say things like, if only he'd give us some fingernails on his figures, and he won't give them a fingernail. He's, as much as I've lived with him, as much as I've worked on him, and as intimate as I feel these paintings are, it's so hard to imagine what he expected. And paintings throughout his career continue to have these, let me just say, almost like strange, inconceivable blemishes. The wonderful Gare Saint-Lazare in the, I can't show it, but in the National Gallery, where you've got that grid, the fence, and the little girls in a blue dress seen from the rear with her hand holding one of the bars of the fence. The hand is terrible. I mean, it is, you can't believe he let it stand like that. And again, this is for me part of what I was sort of trying in this case to sort of almost metaphorically describe as the all or nothing quality of the painting. I mean, if I were doing a crit in an art school and I saw a painting which had a hand like that, I would turn to the person who did it and I'd say, well, you got to fix the hand. Whatever else is going on in this picture, you got to do something about that hand. Manet's not going to do something about that hand. What exactly is going on there? I mean, again, this is what I tried to capture with this almost like metaphorics of all or nothing. And just to be completely clear, in this idea of the all or nothing, it's not at all a matter of saying that you don't see the problem areas, you don't see the strangenesses, you don't see the deliberate salsa. You do. You're seeing all of that, and you're having to say, all right, is this a deal breaker? And for me, from an early age, the answer was no. I don't know what the hell is going on. I can't motivate all of these different things, but it's not a deal breaker. I buy it. I believe in it. I'm convinced. And I do feel there's something about those paintings that raise that issue of conviction very nakedly, and that this should happen at the very moment of the emergence of something that we're going to come to call, or some of us are going to come to call, modernism. And you have the for me, what's part of what's so fascinating historically is the superimposition of the simultaneity of these different crises, however we define crisis. I mean, the crisis of absorption and anti-theatricality, the crisis of connection with the past. It's all falling on Manet and his generation, a particular generation. But he sustains that, and painting makes the turn. It makes the turn into Impressionism and everything that comes out of that. Within a generation, we're even going to have Cézanne. Once we have Cézanne, we have Cubism. But it's on a knife edge at this moment, is sort of my feeling.
Thank you.
Noreen, I see your hand.
Sorry, stickier unmute button than usual. Hello, thank you both for a very engaging set of presentations. I have a question about the crisis theme that keeps coming up. You mentioned just now, Michael, that you know, part of what you're thinking about when you're looking at Manet's painting is the simultaneity of crises, of numerous crises, and then you sort of gestured at the concept itself as having a kind of ambiguous meaning, and it tracked on something I was thinking about as you were speaking. You referred to a kind of crisis of anti-theatricality, and I was wondering what that means. And as I was listening to Joanna's response, it struck me that the kind of reading she was offering through Koselleck of crisis, of a kind of layering of past problems over and superimposing past problems onto present possibilities, future possibilities, and past solutions, this kind of uncanny layering of problems and possibilities and past and present is, you know, offers a kind of theory of crisis, or renders a theory of crisis that tracks with some of the dynamics you were tracing in Manet's painting, but doesn't necessarily, at least to my mind, and please clarify this if I've missed something, I'm sure I have, it doesn't track necessarily with the all or nothing aspect of the painting, which I saw you trying to sort of fit around the reading of the painting more broadly. So I wonder if you could comment on the kind of, maybe what I see as a kind of tension between these layering modes of pasts woven into presents through you know, the Watteauian or the theatrical inheritance that Manet is trying to kind of repurpose in the painting, and the kind of all or nothing cataclysmic reading that you were advancing of the painting. And I would just be curious to hear your thoughts about that. It was the tension point that I did actually hear between your two responses.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Again, I don't know how. I don't know exactly how to answer it. The all or nothing thing, I'd have to say a lot more about the whole issue of the crisis of theatricality and so on and so forth. I mean, this has been the theme of a bunch of books, sort of laying it out, coming to the particular kind of climax that it comes to in Manet in the 1860s. And I'll simply, I guess the relation between that, forgetting for the moment, you know, how exactly we define crisis. Is it something that had been working through painting from Diderot on, from the 1750s on, through French painting, which in my account becomes something like the hidden implicit engine of a great deal of the most important painting of the previous 120 or 100 years, from Chardin through Greuze, through David, through Géricault, through Courbet, I mean, not every significant painter, but a whole lot of major figures, I can subsume in this dialectic that I've devised over the years. The various devices and technologies that had worked by Manet's time aren't working. And this can be shown. Manet then, again, and what's so hard to really understand is there's no way in the world in which Manet would have said any of this. You know, if I had come up to Manet and said, look, I'd like to interview you about your response to the crisis of anti-theatricality that has made possible your glorious paintings. Yeah, he would have looked at me as if I was crazy. This wasn't something which is interesting, because so much of this is nevertheless registered by generations of art critics, going back to the primordial genius of Diderot. But it's not just him. I mean, it works through a whole lot of the art criticism. Nevertheless, what Manet is doing is so much of it intuitive, but it lines up with the quotation from Torre, but it lines up with this remarkable suggestion from Astruc that we should somehow go beyond individual genres. Manet in these pictures is doing something that I don't think he would have known how to describe or how to theorize. He really is stepping into a kind of almost undefinable area of the whole point of the generations before him had been to keep painting from doing that. And suddenly, I mean, painting should be like that. And suddenly Manet realizes, I can't make it like that anymore. It won't work like that anymore. The most it could be like that is if it's Millet, and that doesn't quite work, and anyway, it looks theatrical, as if they're not really peasants, but they're fake peasants. They're not really shoveling manure. They're just pretending to shovel manure. And if that's no longer, I'm doing this, but I don't exactly know how to think about this. Yes, and I have a little bit of precedent in Watteau and some of the others, and that's also going to affect my paint quality, and it's going to lead me. But at the same time, I don't want you to somehow wonder about this person in the picture, so I'm going to blank out there. I'm going to pith them. I'm going to blank out their consciousness. You're going to be faced with these deadpan characters. So that all of that contributes to what I'm calling the all or nothing effect. But it's very hard. Let me put it another way. I can motivate it. I mean, my whole project has been to motivate it historically. I can't motivate it psychologically. I can't get inside his and tell you, as it were, from within why he did that. I can motivate it, as it were, intimately from outside and using the criticism and contextually, understanding contextually in a way, going back to something David said yesterday, as to the aesthetic context, the pictorial context. And it's going to be, it is in itself political too. So Manet believes in a particular French tradition. I mean, he's against what's going to become Napoleon III. He's influenced by a thinker like Michelet. He's Republican. So all of these things are going on at the same time. By the way, let it be said, I mean, I first started arguing this a long time ago. This is not believed within art history, okay? This is not, you're not hearing, these are not views that are at all accepted. There's still, I think Joanna would agree, completely contentious. If there were a big exhibition tomorrow focused on the déjeuner célèbre, not a goddamn word would be said about multiple genres in that painting. That is not something that can be talked about. art history has refused to talk seriously about his use of sources for decades. It raises questions of artistic intention, and how can we possibly talk about issues of artistic intention? Anyway, I thank you for your question.
I see Yiping Ong has a question.
Hi, Michael. Wonderful talk.
Hi, Yiping. Oh, thank you.
So, you describe these paintings as positioned to strike a blow to the neutrality and the indifference of the viewer, partly by way of what you call this air of unreality in the painting. And for others working in this period, like Kierkegaard, what's at stake in striking a blow to the neutrality and the indifference of the public is nothing less than, one's own reality in the face of a kind of derealized world, right? So I'm just wondering, would you say that on your reading of Manet, this is also what's at stake for him in the viewer's conviction? I'm kind of thinking about the last line of your poem.
Say a little bit more, Yiping. So, I mean, again, what's part of the difference between dealing with Kierkegaard and dealing with Manet is that with Kierkegaard, we're talking about a person operating at a level of self-awareness that's almost frightening to contemplate. So that to talk about what he would have intended by such and such is really, we have a lot of basis for doing that. With Manet, we're in this realm of construction. So it's hard for me to ascribe that kind of motive to the person Manet. I mean, one of the things, he wants to succeed. He wants to get a gold medal. He wants to sell his pictures. He wants to, have all the, what Freud mentions. So say more. I might be able to answer the question better.
No, that's all fair. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about this in the context of kind of the larger changes that Kierkegaard is, diagnosing when he looks at, say, the reading public in Denmark. And I'm thinking about that in the context of, Salon de Refusé and a lot, just like a massive amount of people coming to look at this and, people from very different kinds of backgrounds, some of whom may just turn away from it. And, like you said, just, not even think of it as a painting or a painting worth looking at, right? So striking this kind of blow at this sort of indifference of this new kind of public, right?
No, I'd say Manet is ever hopeful. Manet is ever hopeful. This time they're going to get it. My painting, the key word that he uses, maybe a word that he partly gets from Zola, but when he has one-man exhibition, these are paintings that are sincere. He wants. That's a key word for him, and so he doesn't mean it. I mean, he wants success. And if there's anything you'd want to sort of, I mean, this is what frustrates Baudelaire, because Manet is so unhappy that when Manet shows the Olympia in the Salon of 1865. And the jury that year decided, all right, we've been taking a lot of criticism from artists because we kept Manet out of previous salons. So we're going to let him, we'll take his paintings in 65 and let him see what happens. And what happens is the public is so hostile to Olympia that the government has to post a gendarme in front near the picture to keep people from doing damage to it. And Manet is completely depressed. And writes Baudelaire in Brussels, sort of saying, someone is deluding himself here, almost like me or the public. And then Baudelaire writes back and he says, look, it seems I have to talk to you about yourself. You think you're the first artist to have a hard time. Well, this one and this one did, and they were geniuses whereas you are only the first in the decrepitude of your art. An extraordinary remark. And an over-determined remark. I mean, Baudelaire and Manet were very, very close, but Baudelaire would have hated and actually denied that Manet ever cited earlier art. This was something that for Baudelaire was very important, that artists not do. They should have not painting shouldn't have a memory of earlier painting. So Manet is craving success. I mean, and he keeps thinking, you know, sooner or later it's going to work. People are going to see that these are serious pictures, and how he could have. Nevertheless, he paints the Déjeuner Solaire. It's a bit of a mystery. I mean, it's a little bit like Akins being shocked when people were put off by the Gross Clinic. You know, a picture which to this day, if you see it for the first time, you're stunned.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think we'll have time for just one more question. I see Ruth, your hand.
Thank you. And thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I was wondering, in the context of talking about judgment and value, if you would just say something more about what you would have said in that imaginary crit I mean, I know we don't have the Saint-Lazare in front of us, but what's the grounds for your critique of that hand? Is it mimetic in some sense?
No, oh yeah, yeah. No,
like
I'd have to.
Yeah.
I'd have to show it to you. If I showed it to you, you would agree it's a really bad hand.
But as a hand, as a representation of a hand.
Yeah, and even as a piece of painting, it's a little weird. I mean, it's not something that you could say, well, it's an impressionist sketchy hand. If you see it that way, it looks great. Mm-hmm. It looks utterly inept. I mean, I love the picture, but it's just another aspect of this all or nothing quality.
And it looks inept both as a hand. I mean, as a
well, I would have to,
and as a part of that, as a piece of the painting, so that it feels as if it is somehow anomalous in the.
No, well, you know, we'd have to see the picture. I mean, okay. I don't want me abstract to sort of. It's just, let's say, it's a problem. Yeah, you can get a version.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, okay, sure. I see what you mean. I mean, this is probably a different association. So, and I know we're running out of time, so I don't want to prolong this. But I was thinking of another quotation from Thoré that I'm sure you know about Manet, which at least arguably, I mean, suggests something of Thoré's ambivalence toward Manet. I mean, not wholehearted endorsement of what some people would think of as his modernism, where he complained, you know, that of what he called a sort of pantheism, which thinks no more of a head than a slipper, which sometimes bestows even more importance on a basket of flowers than a woman's face. And you know,
this is a very
I don't know whether that's the same issue. Yeah.
No, very standard complaint that Manet gets, and it has to do with that blanking out of consciousness. You know, with the
right.
Yes. By the way, let me just, going back to Yiping's question just for a second.
Sure.
The figures who, in Manet's world, who would be comparable in their attitude towards the public to Kierkegaard would of course be both Baudelaire, but above all Flaubert. And so, you know, where there was, Flaubert is writing books for a public that he fundamentally despises. And even in his own little world, he doesn't have people who can, you know, read him adequately. Manet's attitude towards his public is different. But then go back to Ruth's question. Yes, I mean, Thoré and Manet know each other. Manet actually gives a still life, a flower painting, as a present to Thoré, inscribed "À mon ami Thoré," which is very, very interesting. Because I think Manet is deeply, deeply influenced by Thoré's thought about the French tradition and so on. It's also Torre who discovers Vermeer in the 1860s. And then Manet picks up on that in the luncheon in the studio. So there's very close relations between them. And Torre is a very, very serious art critic. But yes, that pantheism, this is something that is just noted about Manet's art all the way. And it's not unfair. I mean, if you think of something like the portrait of Zola, which is actually described by the young Odilon Redon writing as a critic, it's the face and the head are treated no differently from the clothes or the shoes. And that's partly programmatic with Manet. There are pictures where there's an exception to that. There are individual subjects that grip him. Berthe Morisot in The Balcony, or his incredibly small, wonderful small portrait, which you know very well, of Mallarmé. Yes, this is, and this again is just so deep in Manet, to want to try to blank out the wrong sort of interest, call it psychological interest in the figures. And at the same time, never seeming to recognize that that could be a problem in terms of success. That's, he's ever hopeful. And eventually, a school friend of his, Antonin Proust, gets into a position in the government, and he does get the Legion of Honor. But that's very, very late. But it meant something to him. It would have meant something to him. It wasn't something, he was not going to turn down the Legion of Honor.
Thank you.
I think that brings us around to the end. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you so much, Michael, for these.
Thank you, Joanna.
Back here at 4 p.m. for the final panel.